Thank you. Thank you, John, and thank you to School of Economic Science for having me here. I really do appreciate this opportunity. I think this is going to be a very exciting day. I've been looking forward to this as soon as I heard John's agenda for the day, or his beginning outline a few months ago. I thought this is exactly what's needed. And the reason I think it's highly important to have a discussion like this is because a lot of us have been living in our silos, and we have a very legitimate vision of the monetary system, of adjusting finances, of taxation, of economics in general. But what happens is, being in the silo, we're not necessarily really absorbing the points of view of others who have also valid viewpoints. And it's really critical right now that we do that, because there are key pieces of source code in each of those silos that I think need to be brought together. And it's that source code that's really going to make the difference. It's going to create the catalyst that we're looking for. In my life, I'm a specialist in international development, monetary policy, and about 12 years ago, I got deeply involved in the Commons because I realized that that was the convergence of everything that I had been thinking about in international development and monetary policy, but I hadn't realized it before. Please.
I'm sorry, but could you just spare a moment to explain what you mean by the Commons, so that I really understand, because I don't.
I use two ways of grounding myself when I think about that, what the Commons is. The first is that it's everything that's not privatized and commodified by the private sector and not regulated by the state. So it's not under government control, it's not under private control, it's everything outside of that. However, it also represents things that have been captured by the state and the private sector, which should be in the people's hands and isn't. That's the first thing. And the second thing, there's something about ontology or phenomenology here, being present. It's about what exists in the moment. So that's how we get very clear that what the private sector has done is taken things out of the moment by putting enclosures around them. And so has the government. The government is on a cycle, which is an election cycle. Private sector is on a business cycle. Those aren't ontological. Those aren't in the moment. Those are long-term swings that we have to wait for the outcomes of to get any kind of reward or see that our incentives have really made a difference. In the moment, in the Commons, it's different. We have immediate understanding and immediate value created in the moment. So it's about immediate value creation, actually. And so those are the two things. It's not private, it's not government, and also it's in the moment. We're present to it. Those always ground me when I begin to wander in my mind in terms of what the Commons really represents. And then historically, of course, the Commons represents the common resources that all of us once shared, but we don't anymore because of private boundaries and because of government management of resources. And in coming together with you today, I just wanted to briefly outline what I see are some of the key variables that we really have to take seriously in order to create this monetary adjustment that is forthcoming. As a student of monetary policy, I've realized long ago that the monetary aspect of economics trumps financialization and it trumps trade. So not to diminish them, but trade and finance are dependent largely on monetary policy, even though most of us in Western society or all over the world now don't understand it because of the way economics has been taught. But what I want to focus on first is why we're making this adjustment and how the adjustment's going to be made. Both scarcity and profit are driven by compound interest. That's the price that we're paying for money. And as you know, interest rates lead to hyper competition for money and social inequality and degradation of the physical materials and ecosystems that provide vital life support functions for our survival. Interest rates create incentives for unlimited growth in material consumption, and that undervalues both the input of raw materials from the environment and the output of wastes from the economy. Changing this mindset is going to be an enormous challenge, because many of us still think that the solution to the problems in the world now is to adjust the prices in the market. But prices are only a symptom of the underlying problem, which is that both the supply and the demand for money are manipulated. Commercial banks today create the supply of money as a source of interest-bearing debt and private profit. And at the same time, national central banks control interest rates to manage the demand for new money created by the commercial banks as loans. So the real problem is how to break this monopoly and align the value of public money with the value of our common resources. This means recognizing that the value of our common resources arises not through the efforts or skill of people or organizations who own them or have exclusive access to them, but through the activities and demands of society as a whole. It means putting the money system back into public hands and turning money, not the prices of goods and services, but the value of our currency, into a source of motivation and incentives that support the survival and well-being of society and the planet. Our commons, the shared resources of humanity, give us a clear vision of the purpose of money and how we can make the monetary adjustment that's needed. Peter, if we could move to the next one. This is about adjusting our monetary incentives so that our psychological incentives about how we spend money is also adjusted. Okay, slide number 1. Under the present system of fractional reserve banking, as I hardly need to mention to you, only a small fraction of the money that has been deposited with banks has to be kept in bank reserves. So that means that banks create money out of nothing by writing it as credit into our bank accounts as interest-bearing loans for their own profit. So since money must be lent to replace the original loans that have been paid off as well as the interest paid to banks, the money supply has to grow continually. And we're compelled to earn national currency to buy the necessities of life, to pay our taxes, and to service and repay the debt. This indebtedness can only grow as long as the money needed to pay it back is created through profit by the private sector. But this increasing economic growth and debt repayment stifles the opportunity for community and natural development. It leads to poverty, a gap between rich and poor, the extraction of waste of natural and waste of natural resources. So this isn't a technical issue of banking, really. It's a political issue. So how do we create and manage the supply of money, public money, fairly? The value arising from creating the public money supply is a commons and should be seen as public revenue, not private profit. Our money supply must be converted from interest-paying debt to debt-free money by an agency that is publicly held and managed. This means taking the creation of the national money supply away from commercial banks as profit-making debt and transferring responsibility to the central bank, which issues money as a source of public revenue without interest. The central bank must become a public agency that issues debt-free currency and spends it into public circulation for the good of society. By managing the money supply for the common good, we will stop generating interest to drive the demand for money as debt. Instead of interest-bearing currency flowing into speculative projects, debt-free money will go into projects that foster the long-term value of the commons, and that's for the benefit of society. So it's not just that simple, because there are other aspects to this involved. What do we do to replace the interest rate? Replacing interest-bearing money with debt-free money does not mean that this new currency has no value. A debt-free currency is not value-free. Under a new monetary reserve system, the common assets of the planet would form the basis of a new standard of value, expressing our collective intentions for sustainability. For example, a reserve basket of common goods could include material resources like gold and oil and rare earth minerals, natural resources, air and water quality, ecosystem health and biological diversity, genetic resources, living creatures, organs and minerals, water and the atmosphere, This basket could also include cultural resources, indigenous wisdom, household work and the arts, social resources, health, literacy, economic output, and income distribution, and also intellectual resources, scientific knowledge, intellectual property, and information flows. So this basket could have 15, 20 variables in it, and the withdrawal and replenishment rates of each of these variables of commons would be continuously compared and aggregated. Then an index of the composite sustainability of these commons would be continuously announced and updated in a single value. By expressing the relative dependency and replenishability of the world's key resources, this sustainability rate conveys the capacity of the commons to provide and maintain exclusive wealth for global society. So, as money is spent or gained in every transaction, the deficit or surplus is accounted with reference to the sustainability rate. If the sustainability rate is low on a particular day, money is worth less relative to its value in an exchange, which may cause a buyer to spend less or perhaps not to spend or to postpone the spending. If the sustainability rate is high that day, money is worth more in the exchange, which may convince the buyer to spend more. So the sustainability rate slows the withdrawal rates of depletable resources to allow their stocks to catch up with their flows. It also allows the withdrawal rates of renewable resources to be equilibrated with the replenishment rates that they have. The signals about the actual scarcity of resources and the cost of environmental damage and social disparities are conveyed directly through our money, not the prices of goods and services. When global sustainability is expressed through currency value, each of us then has an immediate realization of the potential impact of our purchasing power in spending, saving, or investing. So this makes it worth less to do ecological and social harm and worth more to be ecologically and socially restorative. The sustainability rate is determined by a new public global central bank, which operates as a public trust on behalf of the global commons to sustain the quality of life and well-being of present and future generations and Earth's living systems. Okay, but that doesn't explain everything. There's more. This model actually entails a whole new system of energy flow through society, or liquidity through society. Since the 17th century, we've been on an ownership model that we've stressed. We claim that people need to be able to protect the resources that they need for their survival and well-being as their property, and that this is their natural right. This argument in Western liberalism has provided the legal justification for the enclosure, ownership, and maximization of profit of the commons by business and government. But neither of the existing property regimes that we have, private and government sector, have a mandate to provide fair access and long-term protection for the common resources of society. And in many places across the world, people who share particular resources, including users, managers, producers, providers of resources, are already managing them through unique forms of self-governance and collaboration. And this is where Eleanor Ostrom comes in, to whom we are dedicating this series of talks. She was the first to really elaborate this in detail. Now, many others have, but she kind of broke the ground because she became more visible than many people had from the 1960s on until her death in June. She's been a tremendous spokesperson for the commons, and the fact that we need to be able to recognize that not only in the traditional sector, where there are rivers and forests and indigenous cultures, or the emerging sector where there is solar energy and intellectual property and the internet, communities and bioregions have already been taking collective action to preserve their resources for themselves and for future generations. Now, the genius about co-production and co-creation of a resource, of a common resource, is the creation of a trust. Now, trusts are created through customary norms or through social charters, which declare the rules and conditions by which people help each other manage and produce what each of them needs. Commons trusts are the only legal and fiduciary institutions that are dedicated to protecting common resources for future generations. They create value not through property ownership, but through the sustainability, quality of life, and well-being of the commons. Number 4. If Entities like corporations can be allowed to have legal standing and personalized rights. Then different kinds of commons can also be given legal standing and rights similar to those of individuals. This gives our common resources protection under public trust law, enabling a trust to set a limit on maximum extraction and use of the commons to preserve this particular resource for future generations. The Commons Trust places a cap on the access and impact, extraction, and use of a particular resource or products and services stemming from that resource. It indicates how much the withdrawal rate from the resource must be slowed to allow for its replenishment. For example, a trust can place a cap on the cutting of forests, the withdrawal of water from lakes and rivers, the use of beaches or parks, or the amount of pollutants that are emitted or dumped. The cap is a differential rate which delineates how much of a particular resource is available for current use in relation to how much to set aside for the future. The criteria used in deciding this cap includes intergenerational metrics such as sustainability, quality of life, and well-being, and the intrinsic worth of these resources for future generations. Commons caps are focused not on the assets of the commons that may have financial value in the marketplace as a source of profit, but on the preservation of common resources and the resilience of the system that manages and produces them. 5. So, having protected a common resource safely for future generations, the Commons Trust relies on the decision of its members on the amount of the resource to be replenished or restored and the amount that may be spent as commons capital. Trustees may decide that a proportion of their common resources may be rented by the trust to the private sector or to state businesses and utilities for extraction and production. Instead of owning a resource, businesses rent the rights to extract and produce the resource from the trust. The private sector profits through the extraction and production of the surplus resources rented to them by the common sector. Businesses thrive because their financial incentives continue to operate as before. But the main difference is that their wealth circulates more freely and equally through society and nature, rather than being captured by individual private interests. Businesses return to their original mission as publicly chartered companies, generating ethical consumption, fair trade, responsible investment, honest business practices, and meaningful jobs. This creates positive externalities through innovation and competition for products and services and adjustment of the market to the actual costs of resources. Long-term wealth arises not through consumer demand, investment, or capital accumulation, but in the enhancement of the carrying capacity of the commons to support life and life systems. 6. Government regulation of the environment has been highly ineffective. Governments are not designed to protect resources. That's not why they were created in the first place. They've added that responsibility on. Government is not equipped to manage the environment because its time horizons and incentives are based on the political election cycle, not on the long-term preservation of our commons. The trust takes over this responsibility, using the rent from the commons to manage or restore natural and material resources. The rental or user fees received by these trusts for the extraction or use of a commons by business or government is reinvested back into the management or restoration of depleted commons. For example, small rents on water resources go directly back into public water management, and rents go directly into public land management from land rents. Rents on agriculture go back into the maintenance of seeds and soil fertility, for example. Carbon rents go back into the public management of the atmosphere. Rents on community health services go back into health education and networking. You get the idea. While trusts primarily manage, preserve, and restore depleted resources, many replenishable commons can also benefit from trusts. But that's another matter. We're looking primarily here at depletable resources in this discussion. Rental fees from trusts can enhance self-generating resources like the arts and intellectual property and digital codes and solar energy. This all takes regulation of the commons out of the hands of government and allows the people who depend on their own commons for survival and well-being to make their decisions and participate in the management and conservation of their own common resources. Number 7. Now, presently, taxes are imposed on incomes, profits, earnings from work, and value added, which people and businesses generate by adding value to the common wealth and well-being. But this creates massive inefficiencies by suppressing innovation, creativity, skills, productivity, development of new knowledge, access to goods and services, culture, and civic life. It also makes the tax burden much greater for the poor than the wealthy and leads to the overuse of critical planetary resources like energy and the environment's capacity to absorb pollution. Why are we penalizing people for the efforts, skills, useful work, and enterprises which they offer for the well-being of others in meeting common needs, and for the value they add to our shared resources by conserving and restoring them? Yet, at the same time, we reward others by not taxing the value that they take from the commons for their own benefit. Instead of taxing our positive contributions to the commons, we should be taxing the value that is subtracted from the commons by those who benefit from the rising value of shared resources. A major shift is needed from taxing the value that people add to the commons for the benefits of society and nature to the value that people subtract from the commons for private self-interest. This includes the unearned profits of landowners, bankers, financiers, corporations, and the rich who are allowed to enclose the value of those common resources for private profit. This will distribute more fairly the public created value of resources which should be shared in common. Business extracts, produces, or uses the common resource and profits from the enterprise. A portion of these profits is taxed by government and spent on public services. The revenue derived from taxing the value that is subtracted from the commons is used as a social dividend or a basic income that's provided to every person as a right of citizenship. This basic income is generated by the taxes on private profits from the private sale of our common resources. It is a new source of public revenue generated by taxing the wealth subtracted from the extraction and use of our common resources for private benefit and provided directly to all citizens as their fair share in the value of the commons. As a tax-free income distributed equally among all citizens, the basic income helps each of us reduce our use of national money and live more sustainable lives and conserve our common resources. The basic income enables us to decide how our share in the value of common resources should be spent in support of our own well-being and that of our families and communities. Number 9. Presently, tax revenues are disconnected from public spending. Taxes are paid over here. They go into a big pot. The politicians decide how they're going to be distributed, and they come out the other end over here. They're not linked together. They're not tied. They're directly disproportionate. One set of people collects taxes. Another set of people spends the money. These agencies are entirely different. Spending money for services and other projects to meet social needs is known as redistribution. With the creation of a basic income for citizens to meet their own needs and the needs of others, we are actually generating a new form of predistribution. Government's role is not to decide how corporations can be financed or subsidized by public money. It is to make decisions on the balance between the amount of tax revenues derived from common resources and the amount of public revenue spent on public services and distributed as basic income. Government will strive under this new model to balance the redistribution of revenue collection with the predistribution of basic income and other public spending. That is, the new role of government is to seek a balance between the taxes from citizens to the state for public spending with the basic income that transfers money from the state to citizens. In this way, the supply of money in circulation is matched with the demand for goods and services that are needed. Number 10. This works also at the global level. An international monetary system with a global reserve currency and a sustainability rate and a system of public global revenue collection would provide new incentives to live in ways that conserve and restore common resources across the planet. It would enable people to meet their own needs and that of their families and communities and distribute the value of the commons more widely and fairly. We could establish a rental fee on many transborder commons. Next slide. Each source of tax revenue would be used to fund commons management and restoration in that same area. For example, a cross-border water tax could be used to provide clean water. A pollution tax could be reinvested in green energy technologies and the maintenance and restoration of the global environment. A carbon tax would go back into the management of the international atmosphere. A tax on forestry would go back to the planting of trees. Global financial transactions tax could go to the regulation of the international exchange system. These tiny fees would have a minimal impact on global trade while encouraging national and local economic development. When all major sectors in the economy are being taxed proportionally across the board, the pain and the risk will be spread around uniformly, which will make the adjustment much easier to accept politically. This will rapidly turn into mutually beneficial relationships, greater accountability, trust, and sharing. We could then generate public spending from the commons that would be directed toward global public spending on food, water, healthcare, education, jobs, ecological management, debt relief, financial and technological transfers to developing nations, disaster relief, peacekeeping, global security. Now, last but not least, number 11. When national and international currencies have adopted the sustainability rate, local communities can reduce their dependence on these currencies, reduce the overhead costs of local government, and achieve a new level of cooperative self-reliance. Communities should now be able to encourage credit unions, development banks, and cooperatives to a greater extent than ever before, including initiatives for recycling and conservation in urban farms, which are less costly and more effective in delivering public services than privately contracted agencies. Local currencies may also be developed by trusts of resource users and producers who manage a shared resource in the local community. By capping a resource, a commons trust may function as a commons bank, issuing debt-free currency at a sustainability rate based on the reserve assets protected under the cap. Commons currency unleashes local creativity, interdependence, and abundance, and increases local purchasing power to meet local needs through local work and the use of local resources. Local economy becomes stronger and more resilient because it can match the quality of goods and services with the quantity of money in circulation, enhancing cooperation and building community. The use of local currencies in exchange for local goods also reduces the costs of trade and transportation and the level of greenhouse gases, leading to a cleaner environment. Local money systems will be recognized as parallel and complementary to the money system at national and international levels, not subordinate to them. And finally, the last piece on number 12. What this is all about, truly, is reversing the dictum of John Baptiste Say and many others who have supported it. All the economists who are supply-siders have said the same thing. And John Maynard Keynes, in his attempt to create a demand-side economic system, virtually said the same thing. Build it and they will come. The theory that supply creates its own demand. We need a new understanding of supply and demand. Western economics has a well-developed understanding of supply, but a very poor understanding of demand. The trouble started with John Locke. Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Baptiste Say contributed to this. Karl Marx observed the definitions of surplus value and why supply was becoming very disconnected from demand. The Keynesian policies defined effective demand by conflating individual purchasing power with personal preference satisfaction. And what we need is to move beyond that, because many people in the present crisis are trying to revert back to Keynesianism. We've got to move forward. We've got to recognize that the commons demonstrate that the interior values of people, individuality, and collectivity are the means by which exterior systems change. This is how inner demand is balanced with outer demand. Our currency must set the intentions for collective value and sustainability. It is through our system of monetary value that the inner value of all individuals together is expressed through the inherent conditions of planetary resources, not through external prices in the marketplace. Debt-free currency with a sustainability rate Commons trust, capping resources, renting the surplus to business and creating a revenue stream to manage and restore the commons. Taxing the value subtracted from the commons to create a basic income. Uniting tax revenue with public spending. And creating global commons revenue to fund global public spending. And creating commons currencies to make local economies stronger and more resilient. These measures will adjust the supply to the demand. That's why a new understanding of supply and demand is greatly needed in the transitional economics of the 21st century. Demand must create supply. Following that, supply and demand will be in balance. This will create an operating framework of supply and demand that's somewhat similar to the yin-yang of Chinese Taoism, in which both sides are vital and interdependent. Thank you. I hope we have a very engaging day, and I hope I've set some context within which we can begin to analyze some of these burning issues.